Hi, welcome to the garage. I'm David Schoneman. Have you ever wondered about taking a pile of rusty, old, vintage motorcycle parts like this and making them into something like this? We're going to show you how. Stay with us. Hi, welcome back to the garage. We're building a vintage BMW motorcycle out of a bunch of old parts that we have lying in boxes around the shop here. If you saw the last show, we took a look at some of the different styles that we might want to build. We had Cafe Racer, Scrambler, or Roadster, or Enduro. There are plenty others too, but we focused on one in particular, and that's the Roadster. I think that based on the parts that we have, we talked about that last time too, the parts that we have, including a fresh 1000cc motor and a frame with matching numbers, we decided that we're going to build a Roadster out of those parts. So I talked at the end of the last show about some of the surprises I found when I was conducting inventory. We have to take a look at not just at the basics, like do we have a motor and a frame, but what about all the nuts and bolts and carburetors and clutches and everything else that go into making a complete bike. So I've been diving into those boxes a little more thoroughly and found a few surprises, which we're going to go over today. But since the key thing on this bike was the motor, as I said last time, we want to showcase and take full advantage of this freshly overhauled and upgraded 1000cc BMW motor. There weren't too many of these relative to the smaller motors. There were a lot of 650s, a lot of 750s. 800s were popular and good, and so were 900s. But the 1000s, it's the largest one in that vintage, in that era, mid-70s we're talking about, and it was a good, strong motor. So we have one of those, fresh, never been run, in its current assembled state, and we're going to take full advantage of that for this bike. So what I've done here is I've laid out the drivetrain. Since we're focusing on the motor, I want to talk about how we're getting the power from the motor to the rear wheel. Do we have the components that we need? In a later episode, we'll talk about the frame and forks and all those kinds of things. But for today, we're going to take a look at our drivetrain. Starting with the motor, I'm going to come around here and just explain a couple of things. This is the boxer engine. Cylinders come out the side, and we have intake on the back side. This is the front of the bike, by the way, and that would be the rear of the bike. Intake on this side and exhaust on this side. Exhaust would come out and head towards the back of the bike. Since we're starting at one end and working our way down, we're going to start with exhaust. This BMW motor is designed with 38 millimeter exhaust pipes. Where in the United States, we don't use metric systems quite as much. 38 millimeter pipe is designed to go into the head here. And in this country, we have pipe that's measured in inches. And 1.5 inch pipe is very, very close to 38 millimeter, but it's not exactly the same. And we've got a little issue with that. We don't have a header pipe, by the way. We don't have exhaust pipes in all the boxes of parts. So we have to either buy one, or in this case, I think I want to try making one. If I want to make one with the requirement that it be 38 millimeter, we have a couple issues. I have some stock pipe here. This is 1.5 inch muffler pipe, readily available here in the United States, but it won't fit the head. So I took it to my friend Joe's house, and he's got a machine shop and he's got a lathe, and we turned some of this pipe in a lathe. We took a few thousandths of an inch off on the other end of the same piece of pipe, but it still doesn't want to go in. We took a few more off, and we found that eventually we did have a piece of pipe that fit into the head. The pipe will go into the head. It'll be bent, of course, and this piece will slide over, and there'll be some compression rings in here that will screw on to attach it. So the first surprise, essentially, is that our 1.5 inch pipe doesn't fit the 38 millimeter head. So we'll have to put some pieces on a lathe and grind them down a little bit so that they will fit this motor. But it can be done, and that's what we're going to do. I'm going to turn the motor back around the other way here, and we'll take a look next at carburetors. Carburetors will sit on the back of the motor, one on each side, and I've got several different carburetors here. These are the carbs that came with this motor. This is a 32 millimeter Bing carburetor. It's a CV carburetor, constant velocity. CV means constant velocity. The carburetor sits on the back of the motor like this. There will be a rubber boot that attaches the carburetor to the motor. I thought that I had the right carburetors for this engine, but I don't. The 32 millimeter carburetor is too small for the 1000 cc. This motor was originally a 750 cc, and a 32 millimeter carburetor was the right size for that. So with the bumped up engine, we need a bigger carburetor. 32 millimeter, by the way, refers to the diameter of the venturi inside the carburetor. We'll speak more about carburetors later, but for now, I just want to give you the overview of what we're running into. This is a CV carburetor. It's got a rubber diaphragm in it. These are very good for everyday riding. You can go up and down a mountain like Mount Washington, and the carburetor will adjust to the elevation changes. It also adjusts by itself pretty well to temperature changes. But you're not going to get quite as much power out of a CV carburetor as you might out of a carburetor like this. This is a 36 millimeter Mikuni carburetor. It's a popular aftermarket carburetor for all kinds of motorcycles, including BMWs. This carburetor has a slide. This is not a CV type. It doesn't have a rubber diaphragm in it. When you twist the throttle, you're directly raising the slide inside the carburetor, if you can see that. Again, we're going to talk more about carbs later. But this carburetor is a 36 millimeter. And again, it's just a little bit too small. This motor, the 1000 cc motor, is supposed to have a 40 millimeter carburetor on it. So the 32 is clearly too small. The 36, it's a little too small. And I've done some research on it, and what I found is that in an aftermarket carburetor like this, which is a great carb, a 38 millimeter is the right size. And there are two different styles of Mikuni 38 millimeter that would be appropriate for this. One is called a round slide. This is a round slide carburetor. The piece that moves up and down inside is round. And the other is a flat slide carburetor. They're, again, 38 millimeter, a little more power out of them, and a little better breathing. So I think what I'm going to do, since I don't have the right carb for this engine, I'm going to order some 38 millimeter flat slide carbs. And that's a very good carburetor for this strong engine. Again, what our goal is to get as much out of this engine as we can. This is a roadster. We want to have plenty of power, plenty of acceleration. Not necessarily for high speed, but to enjoy the acceleration. So broad strokes on the carburetor. We have a bunch of carbs, and I have more over there, but none of them is right for this engine. All right, next, after the engine makes its power, we have to begin transmitting that power towards the rear wheel. First thing we have on the back of the motor, I'm going to spin this again, is a flywheel. As the motor turns, this flywheel is going to spin. And the flywheel is mated to a clutch. Clutch sits in there. Then the transmission mates through the clutch to the motor. And I've had a clutch, we got a flywheel, we got a transmission. Unfortunately, they don't match. They don't go together. So this is a 1000 cc motor that was built from a 1976 R75, so 750, so a 1976 motor. The transmission did not come from this motor. This transmission is a 5-speed, and it's a post-1981. So we've got a 1981 or later transmission with a 1976 motor, and BMW changed the design. I didn't know it at the time, but they changed the design for mating this engine up to this transmission through that clutch. So the flywheel we have on here is not the flywheel this motor would have come with. This happens to be, I'm glad it is, this is the post-81 flywheel. And we need a post-81 clutch to go with the post-81 transmission. I found a clutch in the box of parts, and it's a good clutch. It's got plenty of life left in it. We're ready to go, except that's a 1976 clutch. So the 1976 clutch isn't going to work for us on this assembly. So I did some digging, and I found someone who had a 1981 or post-1981 clutch, and I've already ordered it. This project's going to involve buying a lot of parts. We have the basics, like we said last time, but there's still a lot of parts that are going to be missing, and we have to start sourcing them. This is a used clutch. but it's in very good condition. If you're going to build a bike out of some old parts, you're going to be purchasing some parts. If you happen to buy a project bike that was all one bike at one time and someone just took it apart and never put it back together, the chances of those parts being correct are pretty high because they all came from one motorcycle. In this case, that's not what happened. I got this project from someone who had just boxes and boxes of miscellaneous parts. He was going to put something together, but in the end didn't do it, and that's how I ended up with it. But the parts that he was collecting did not come from a single bike in the beginning, and they're kind of mixed and matched, or not matched in this case, and we have to source them. So a good source for used parts is eBay, or you can take a look at forums online. I found these parts through someone who is known in the forums, and he has a bunch of parts. Actually, it happens to be right here in New Hampshire, which is great. So the parts of the clutch that we're going to put in, we're not going to put it in today, but the parts in the clutch that are critical are, first of all, the clutch spring. When we squeeze the clutch lever, we're operating a clutch on a spring. This will go in first. It's a disc with fingers cut in it that holds the discs together when the clutch is operating. Next is going to be a plate here. The clutch disc itself, this is the part that you would normally replace if you're replacing a clutch. It's got fiber on each side, and it's pinched together by the spring between these two plates. And as all this spins, this clutch can come apart, open up, or close to grab onto the disc itself. So this clutch is a 1981 clutch. It's in great shape, but I had to source it because although we had a wonderful clutch, it wasn't the right one. Now, I'm glad that we have the clutch. I'm glad I'm able to find this clutch. I'm glad we have the right flywheel here. This is a 1981 transmission. The splines are a little shorter than a 76. There were 5-speed transmissions available, and if this was an earlier transmission, we could use the earlier clutch, but then we would have needed to change to an earlier flywheel. This flywheel is not compatible with this clutch, but this flywheel is compatible with this clutch, and this transmission is compatible with this clutch. So based on the sourcing that I did, we are now able to put this engine together with the clutch and connect it to the transmission. Like I said last time, the transmission on these motorcycles is separate from the engine. If you're working on a Honda or a Kawasaki or one of the other Japanese bikes, you're going to find that in most cases, I can't imagine any where it's not the case, the transmission is built into the engine case, so you won't have to worry about that. There is a clutch, certainly on those bikes as well, but you're not going to have the issue of having a 1981 transmission not matching up to a 1976 motor. So we have that issue. Also, before we move further down the line here, I want to talk about the starter motor up here. Starter motor fits on top. These starter motors, I have 3 of them. I bench tested them all, and they all operate. So we have 3 good starter motors. One of them is 8 teeth and 2 are 9 teeth. And I believe that we need a 9-tooth starter for this motor. I'm going to confirm that because 9-tooth was correct for this motor for a 1976 motor, but where we have the 1981 clutch, which has a ring gear out here that the starter motor engages with, I want to make sure that the 9-tooth starter will work with the 1981 flywheel. If not, it could be an 8-tooth, and we have one of those in the box too. Like I say, we have 3, they all work, and so we'll find the right starter motor to put in here. And then on top, we have a cover that will sit on there like this. We'll also have a cover for the front of the motor and a cover for the back. Actually, the transmission goes there. We'll have a cover for this section here. But that's the motor. And again, we're just talking about power, how we're getting the power, basic engine components, get that power back to the rear wheel. We're going to need to have an alternator on the front. I've got a whole box full of alternators, original, and we're going to test one of those, find the right one. We'll talk about that when we talk about the electrical system. But for now, we've got the mechanical aspect of the engine. We know what we have to do for an exhaust. We're going to make an exhaust. We're going to weld that together. Most likely, you might bend it, but most likely weld. And we're going to fit that up with some custom milled pipe, so that we can get it into the head. And we're going to get flat slide Mikuni carburetors to go on the back, which will give us the most power that we can get. All right, so we've got engine, clutch, transmission. Moving further back, we have the swing arm. Now, the swing arm bolts to the frame, and then this will move up and down, shock absorbers connected here to the frame, and this is where the rear wheel will go. The swing arm connects to the back of the transmission on this drive shaft universal joint. This motorcycle is not driven by a chain. You see a lot of motorcycles that are chain drive. This is not chain drive. This is drive shaft. So the transmission will spin the shaft, and as the shaft spins, it will go through the final drive, which we'll speak about in just a moment. So we're going to have to connect. I have several swing arms, 4 of them as a matter of fact, and this one seems to be in the best condition. Last time I spoke about long wheelbase or short wheelbase on these BMW swing arms. This is a long wheelbase. I want a long wheelbase on this one. Anyway, so I'm glad we have a long wheelbase swing arm. It's going to give us a little more stability. With the power that we have, we're not scrambling up hills like on a scrambler or an enduro. I'm not seeking highway riding, but I do want to have some reasonable stability, even though we're going through some of the twisty roads, back roads here. So the long swing arm will increase the stability. It will increase the overall size of the bike. Again, the larger bike, I think, will fit me a little better. So the swing arm bolts up to the back of the transmission, and there's a rubber boot that goes over this. We have a boot. It's in good shape. Parts like the rubber boot are readily available. Transmission could be hard to find. You're certainly not going to find one new. Swing arm could be hard to find. Again, you'd be finding it used, not new. But the nice thing about BMWs is that even though this is a 1976 or 1981 with I don't know what vintage swing arm, the rubber boot that goes between the two is readily available today, brand new from a BMW dealer. So if this was a Kawasaki or a Honda, unless that boot was being built into a current model, you would never be able to find it new. It would only be used. But BMW keeps many of their old parts, which are no longer used on a modern motorcycle. They do continue to make them and keep them in stock because these bikes can go a long distance. 100,000 miles is not unheard of, which is a lot for a motorcycle, and certainly more than a lot of Japanese motorcycles will typically go. And nothing wrong with Japanese motorcycles. I like them, but it's just a different kind of a bike. So we are able to find some parts if we need them. So we're going to replace the bolts. These are one-time use bolts that go from the swing arm or from the universal joint onto the transmission, and we're going to have a new rubber boot also. Okay, next, on the back of the swing arm, we have this piece. This is called the final drive. And this will bolt on. If you can't quite see it, but there are splines inside here, and there are splines in here. These two pieces go together and bolt. The 4 bolts go into these 4 holes, and the swing arm goes together, and then the wheel goes on here. The swing arm has a gear ratio in it. This ratio is stamped right on the case of the final drive. In this case, it's 3411. That means that the gear that comes on the shaft here has 11 teeth, and the ring gear that meshes with has 34 teeth. That ratio, it's a final drive ratio. If you have a truck or you are into car racing or something, you're going to know that the differential rate, the final drive ratio is critical. And the higher, or one ratio can give you better acceleration, but not as much top speed. Another ratio will give you more top speed, but not as much acceleration. This 3411 is a good number for a 1,000 cc motor if you're doing highway driving. It's going to enable you to go fast. The acceleration isn't so much going to come from the ratio as it's going to come from the horsepower available. Now, I like acceleration. I would prefer to have something like maybe a 3711, which means that we get a little more acceleration than we would with this unit. but we don't have a 3711. I wish we did. We don't. They're available. I can get one, but they're not inexpensive. And since we have this one, I think I'm going to put it together in this bike, and we'll see how it goes. If I feel like we need more acceleration, then I'll swap it out. And you can see that it's right at the back end of the bike. And to get the swing arm off, or to get the final drive off when the bike is fully assembled, isn't terribly difficult. We would take the wheel off, jack the bike up, take the wheel off. It readily comes off. It's an axle that runs through here. We take the axle out, take the rear wheel off, disconnect the shock absorber. The one shock absorber on the left side of the bike attaches here on the swing arm to the frame, and the other one attaches on the right side of the bike to the stud. So we need to take the shock absorber off the right side of the bike, and then we can just unbolt these 4 bolts, and this final drive unit will come right off. Once it's off, we can just as easily put a new one on that's a little different ratio. And so we may experiment with that, depending on what we find with this one. But since this one is perfectly serviceable and a good match for the 1000 cc motor for speed, we're going to give it a try first. Again, I'm not sure what it's going to feel like. And on this bike, I'm looking for the feel, to see what it feels like to ride it. So that's our overall drivetrain. Engine, clutch, transmission, swing arm, and final drive. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the other components that we found that were a little bit of a surprise to us. And that's what's going to happen when you're building a bike and you start going through the parts. It may look like you have everything, but in fact, you don't. So we can say that we have, kind of joking around, we have 90% of the parts we need, and we're just missing the other 90%. And it's just the way it goes. We have what looks like a complete motorcycle, but there's a lot of pieces in between that are missing. There's a piece that goes on the back of the transmission here, by the way, which is the clutch actuating arm. The clutch rod will sit in here, and when you squeeze the clutch lever, there's a lever here that will move to disengage the clutch. I have 3 or 4 of them for an earlier transmission. So once again, we've had to source some parts. I haven't received it yet, but we're sourcing a new part here. Not new. No, they're pretty expensive if we can find them new, but we're going to get a used one that is the right lever for this transmission. So with your project, if you are building something, you're going to find that you're missing a lot of parts. Do a complete inventory. Don't be surprised or discouraged if you find that you're missing something. Parts are available. If you're doing a Japanese bike, it's most likely going to be just used parts, but they're out there because those bikes were made by the millions. And there's certainly people out there who are taking them apart and looking for the parts. So that's our discussion of the drivetrain for this motorcycle project. I hope you're enjoying it so far. If you like the show, please hit the like button down below and subscribe to our channel. We want to know that people are watching and interested. Also, if you'd like to get a hold of me, if you have any questions about a project you're working on or any ideas for this one, please send me an email. You can reach us at milliard.moto@gmail.com. Send us an email. We're also on Instagram, milliardmoto, and on Facebook, milliardmoto. Send us your thoughts, ask questions. We're happy to answer them. And again, if you have any kind of project you're working on, you have some questions about that, let us know. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.